You ever have that neighbor who treats the whole block like their personal kingdom? The kind who knows every mailbox, every seedling, every inch of paint, and thinks that gives them the right to decide how everyone else lives. That was Evelyn Pierce on Willow Run, the woman with a custom clipboard, a sharper smile, and an opinion about everything that didn't belong to her. I thought I knew how to deal with petty rules and passive-aggressive letters, until one night I realized Evelyn didn't just patrol the neighborhood, she was walking through my front door. My name is Sam Walker. I keep things simple: a battered coffee maker, a workbench I never quite finish, and a little terrarium on the kitchen counter where a small green anole named Scout sunbathes on a rock. Scout is ridiculous small, blink-eyed, the kind of pet that makes you smile for no reason and for reasons that seemed harmless at first. Evelyn decided Scout was a community concern. That's how the meeting started, a single loud voice at the HOA table declaring my lizard a violation, as if a wrinkled clipboard translates into authority inside someone else's home. I laughed it off then, because what else do you do when the HOA president brings theatrics to a Tuesday night? But then things changed. A photo of Scout showed up in the HOA newsletter taken from an angle only possible inside my kitchen. A spoon I swore I left in the sink was on the counter where I keep mail. The key under the fake rock in my planter? Gone. At first I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe I'd misplaced things. Then late one Friday, I pulled into my driveway and saw Evelyn standing by my mailbox, smiling at the sunset, like she belonged there. Her perfume hit me before her words did. Expensive, floral, the kind you remember, and I realized something that made my chest go cold. Someone had been in my house. Confrontations can be awkward or explosive. The difference usually comes down to whether the other person believes they're untouchable. I went next door. I knocked. Evelyn answered in a cardigan that had an embroidered HOA crest, and she smiled like she was welcoming me into a club I'd never asked to join. "Sam," she said, as if we were old friends. "So nice of you to stop by." I told her calmly that things in my house had been moved, that my key was missing, that I had reason to believe someone entered without permission. Her smile tightened just enough to be a warning. "We're all trying to keep Willow Run beautiful," she said. "Sometimes I check on things. You know, for the neighborhood." When I asked for an explanation, she got theatrical, a little gasp, a hand to her chest, and a version of the truth that sounded like performance art. She left me feeling small and ridiculous, and that's the point of gaslighting. You second-guess yourself until you stop trusting what you know. So I started leaving my phone on the counter, recording the terrarium from odd angles, an awkward little camera setup on a bookshelf, because if something keeps happening and the polite conversation doesn't stop it, evidence has a funny way of being decisive. I also called my friend Marcus, a retired metal worker who likes to make things that don't ask permission. Marcus is the kind of guy who builds a gate out of scrap steel and somehow makes it look elegant. He listened, briefed me on legal boundaries, and then said what men like him usually say when they mean business. "We'll make sure she can't pretend she didn't know." We talked through options. Honesty would have been fine if Evelyn had ever been honest, but she'd made a habit of crossing lines under the guise of civic duty. I felt foolish for thinking a polite conversation would fix it. So we built a controlled sting, a trap that didn't involve violence, just the theatrical overturning of a false authority. We staged Scout's terrarium in the place people tend to look most, the kitchen counter by the window, where the sun hits the glass and a quick hand could reach for the tank. We set up cameras with wide lenses and motion sensors, and all evening we rehearsed the appearance of ordinary routines. A cup left on the counter, the radio playing, the porch light off. We wanted normal. We wanted to make sure the record would show exactly what happened without leaving room for excuses. When Evelyn took the bait, she acted like she had a right to be inside. She came in with that same calm, practically humming, like a woman who collects neighborhoods the way other people collect stamps. She moved the terrarium the way someone rearranges a garden gnome, practiced, casual, almost proprietorial. Maybe she told herself it was for the community. Maybe she told herself she was making order. Maybe she just liked being the person who knew the private things. She put her hand on Scout's tank and smiled because she knew she expected that no one could call her out. That's when the motion sensor triggered, the camera's word, and a recorded voice, mine, calm and flat, announced that the authorities had been called. What followed felt like the slow, cinematic scraping of a scene being flipped. Evelyn's face went through the stages of someone who's trying to perform surprise, but can't remember the lines. She started to speak, to spin a tale, to speak about oversight and safety and how she was helping. The tape caught her voice, clipped and confident, repeating phrases she'd used at the HOA table with that same practiced smile. I could see the neighbors from across the street gathering, drawn by the lights and the noise, and somewhere in the distance a patrol car's siren, not the kind that shows up to film a TV show, but the real kind that makes the throat tighten. When officers arrived, the cameras were the simplest kind of witness. Time-stamped, continuous, unembellished. Evelyn tried to talk her way out. "I was checking on a potential hazard," she said. Voice smooth, but the video showed her using my spare key, showed her moving things, the way she'd said later that she'd been protecting the community while bending someone else's privacy into a justification. They ran her name. They asked questions. They checked the HOA records and found something that fit a pattern. Complaints about neighbors that conveniently led to private entries, a dossier of concerns that helped Evelyn claim she was acting out of duty. Once the veneer of protection crumbles, you see the loneliness beneath the hunger for control. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps explain the motive. The court case wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it. It was bureaucratic and human. Police reports, sworn statements. A prosecutor who was tired of neighbors who think the law bends for them. Evelyn's defense was to insist she acted in good faith, that the HOA empowered her to keep an eye out. The tape didn't argue. The tape showed a woman entering a private home without consent, and the judge did what a judge does when shown clear, intentional trespass. They ruled in favor of the defendant's right to privacy. Evelyn was fined, given a restraining order, and required to surrender any duplicate keys. The community found out in a way it couldn't ignore, redacted copies of her files, a notation in the HOA minutes, a whisper that became a conversation in grocery stores and coffee shops. I didn't feel triumphant the way I thought I might. There's a strange hollowness after things escalate and the truth comes out, because victory doesn't make the small moments of violation disappear. The nights you wake wondering how many times someone has been in your home, the way you change the arrangement of a shelf so it feels less like an invitation. I felt vindicated, of course, but also tired. Justice is not catharsis. It's paperwork and court dates and the way your chest unclenches a little. Marcus patted my shoulder and said, "You did right." And I believed him, even if a part of me still worried about how far we'd gone to prove a point. There's a line here about community, about the difference between guardianship and ownership. Evelyn had convinced herself that her role conferred ownership over people's private lives, that enforcing standards meant crossing thresholds. What she didn't count on was someone who kept a record, a neighbor who would refuse to be gaslit into silence, and a friend who would help build a test that exposed truth without crossing into harm. We didn't humiliate her for sport. We made a record. We made the neighborhood see. In the end, Scout is still on the counter, sunning like nothing happened, which feels both absurd and exactly right. Life goes on in ways that are stubbornly ordinary. Mowing the lawn, fixing a light switch, answering an email. Evelyn moved away a few streets over, still on the HOA board in theory, but with restrictions that made it clear she no longer had the free hand she once believed belonged to her. People started to talk differently at the monthly meetings, less performative tisk-tisk and more records, minutes, transparency. Maybe that's the real change. Not a public shaming, but a new set of guardrails that keeps private life private. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that civility isn't a substitute for consent, and authority without accountability is just a polite kind of theft. I don't want the story to be a blueprint for escalation. I want it to be a reminder that ordinary people have the right to close doors and keep them closed. If you keep a record, if you keep your calm, sometimes the truth will catch up with those who think they're entitled. So here's where I leave it. Scout naps on the same rock. The terrarium light clicks on at dusk, and I brew coffee the same way every morning with too much grounds and not enough patience, and I watch the neighborhood breathe a little easier. If you've ever had someone overstep like Evelyn, you know how personal it feels, and you know the line between community care and control. Tell me what you think. Was I right to set the trap, or should I have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts below. Share your stories about boundary crossing neighbors. And if you like this one, tell a friend who needs to hear it.